December 17th, 1944. Before dawn, the forests of the Ardennes lay under a silence that was both beautiful and terrifying. A pale mist clung to the frozen earth, the air so cold that each breath crystallized into white vapor. Within that stillness, the deep metallic cough of a Tiger tank shattered the quiet. The Maybach engine sputtered once, twice, and then died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper struck the hatch with his fist, the sharp clang echoing like a funeral bell through the darkness. His driver's voice trembled from below, fuel tanks dry, reserve tanks dry. Around them, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers sat stranded in the winter cold. An entire armoured spearhead, frozen not by enemy fire, but by emptiness. Peiper climbed down from his immobilized Tiger, his boots crunching against the frozen soil. Before him lay the outskirts of Honsfeld, a village abandoned in haste by the US 99th Infantry Division. Smoke rose lazily from oil drums left burning, half-finished mugs of coffee still steamed on metal tables. And then he saw them. Rows upon rows of olive-drab jerry cans, stacked 3 meters high, stretching hundreds of meters into the fog. The distinct shape of American fuel containers, thousands of them, like a miraculous offering in the middle of a war defined by scarcity. His adjutant, Hans Gruller, cracked one open, the sharp, pungent scent of high-octane gasoline rising into the cold air. It was the very substance the Reich bled for, rationed by the litre, fought for in the oil fields of Romania, and destroyed in synthetic plants under Allied bombs. Here it lay abandoned in pyramids, as if the enemy had so much they could not be bothered to burn it before retreating. The mathematics staggered even a veteran like Peiper. 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel Honsfeld, is Kampfgruppe for the push to the Meuse River. Enough, in theory, to change the course of the offensive. Yet as he stood among this bounty, watching his men feverishly pour American fuel into German tanks, a crushing truth descended with the morning fog. If the Americans could leave behind what Germany guarded with divisions, if they could afford to abandon 50,000 gallons without a second thought, then this war was already lost. Germany hadn't just miscalculated strategy, it had misunderstood the very nature of its enemy. The first engines roared back to life just after sunrise. German mechanics pumped the captured American gasoline into tanks with the desperation of drowning men gulping air. One by one, the Tiger IIs growled awake, their long 88-meter barrels rising like iron serpents from the mist. To Peiper's soldiers, the sound was salvation, proof that their thrust into Belgium was not yet dead. But to the few captured American prisoners forced to watch, it was the sound of their own army's abundance being turned against them. Peiper surveyed the scene with calculated precision. His Kampfgruppe had been designed as a scalpel, a sharp, armoured spearhead tasked with cutting through the Allied lines, driving to the Meuse River and seizing bridges before the Americans could react. Time, however, was everything. The fuel he had found bought him hours, perhaps a day, but not more. His officers knew it, his men knew it. Even the engines, rumbling hungrily, seemed to know that their lifeblood was measured in minutes, not miles. He ordered the column forward. Tigers and panthers rolled through Honsfeld's narrow streets, their tracks crushing wooden fences and stone walls. The village itself seemed like a museum of America's logistical power. Untouched crates of K-rations, stacks of ammunition, even parked jeeps left with the keys dangling in the ignition. The irony gnawed at Peiper. His men fought with dwindling supplies, patching uniforms with scavenged cloth, rationing bread until it turned to stone. The Americans, by contrast, abandoned luxury in war's harshest winter. Then came the darker orders. To secure the column's advance, Peiper's men rounded up stragglers, American soldiers who had not fled in time. They were herded at gunpoint into a field. The SS officers debated. Keeping them as prisoners would slow the advance, letting them go risked betrayal. What followed remains one of the mystères. Ost contested and damning chapters of Peiper's campaign, the Malmedy massacre. Over 80 US prisoners were executed in the snow. For Peiper, it was brutality born of calculation. For history, it became a stain that could never be erased. As his tanks rumbled westward, fueled by captured gasoline and dark resolve, Peiper carried both triumph and dread in his heart. He had secured 50,000 gallons of life, but every drop burned carried with it the weight of atrocities, the shadow of inevitability, and the unshakable reminder that fuel alone could not win a war already lost. By midday, the column stretched for miles, an armoured serpent winding through the snow-laden valleys of the Ardennes. Tigers, panthers, half-tracks and motorcycles advanced in a thunderous procession, their engines gulping down the captured American gasoline. Black smoke trails marked their progress like scars across the white sky. Inside the tanks, the air was chokingly hot, the stench of gasoline and oil burning in soldiers' nostrils as they rattled forward. For Peiper, momentum was oxygen. He drove his men hard, knowing that every hour gained brought him closer to the Meuse River, and every delay handed the initiative back to the Allies. His orders were merciless: seize fuel wherever it was found, take villages intact if possible, burn them if not. The blitzkrieg that had once terrified Europe was reborn in miniature across the Ardennes, its success no longer measured in territory, but in gallons of fuel. Yet cracks appeared almost immediately. The American fuel was powerful, but inconsistent in compatibility. Mechanics scrambled to adjust carburetors, filter lines, and recalibrate engines that coughed and stalled on foreign gasoline. Some tanks roared confidently down the road. Others sputtered and choked before lurching to a stop. To the common soldier, it was a cruel reminder that their advance relied not on strategy or valor, but on scavenged luck. As the column pressed deeper, they encountered pockets of American resistance. Small groups of GIs, armed with bazookas and machine guns, fired from the tree lines, slowing the advance. Each skirmish wasted fuel. Each firefight consumed time. Peiper's officers urged him to bypass resistance, but the towering tigers were slow to maneuver, forced to grind forward through obstacles rather than around them. What should have been lightning war became a slog through snow and smoke. Still, the German soldiers fought with ferocity. Many believed this offensive, the Ardennes gamble, was Germany's last chance to turn the war. They imagined breaking through, splitting the Allied front and forcing peace talks on their terms. But as they rolled past abandoned American fuel depots, field kitchens, and even supply trucks with radios still playing jazz music, the scale of Allied abundance became undeniable. The Germans lived on scraps, the Americans fought with surplus. Every captured gallon felt like a gift from fate, but also like a mocking reminder of how lopsided the war had become. And deep within his command half-track, Peiper clenched his fists, staring westward. He knew that fuel, not courage, would decide this offensive. And courage his men had in plenty. Fuel, they did not. Night fell quickly in the Ardennes. The forest, cloaked in fog and frost, swallowed sound and light, turning the battlefield into a shadowed labyrinth. Peiper's column halted briefly in the village of Bulge, engines idling as men refueled under the ghostly glow of lanterns. Soldiers huddled around fires, their breath rising in clouds, their eyes reflecting both exhaustion and grim determination. The 50,000 gallons seized at Honsfeld had been the miracle that saved them from immobility, but the miracle was already burning away, mile by mile. Peiper walked among his men, the crunch of snow under his boots, the only sound louder than the growl of engines. He studied their faces, young men hardened by years of war, veterans who had fought from the steppes of Russia to the beaches of Normandy. They carried the weight of loyalty, not to victory, that dream had long soured, but to each other, to the soldier next to them in the frozen dark. He knew morale was fragile, bound together by hope and fear in equal measure. And he knew the truth he could not say aloud. Every kilometre westward was a gamble against time and fuel. Orders crackled over the radio. Push forward at dawn. The High Command in Berlin demanded speed, demanded breakthroughs, demanded that Peiper's armoured fist smash its way to the Meuse without hesitation. They did not care that every Tiger consumed 4 gallons of gasoline for every mile. They did not care that every firefight drained their reserves further. In Berlin, maps and arrows promised victory. In the Ardennes, Peiper's men lived by drops of fuel. That night, an eerie stillness settled over the forest. Snowflakes drifted silently from the black sky, coating the tanks and tracks in a pale shroud. Somewhere in the distance, American artillery rumbled, muffled by the heavy air. The men of Kampfgruppe Peiper lay in foxholes, some whispering prayers, others staring blankly into the fire, wondering if they would live to see another dawn. Peiper himself sat in the command half-track, his gloved hands tracing lines across a map. He had fuel enough for 1 hard thrust, perhaps 2. Beyond that, he would be at the mercy of fortune, of finding more American stockpiles, of seizing more abandoned depots. His entire fate, and perhaps the fate of the Reich's last gamble, depended not on strategy alone, but on whether gasoline could be found in enemy barrels. The Ardennes was no longer just a battlefield, it was a hunt for fuel, and the hunter knew he was also being hunted. At first light, the forest shook with the grinding thunder of steel. Peiper's column lurched forward again, its length now stretching over 20 kilometers of winding Ardennes roads. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery and supply trucks groaned westward, a river of war forced to flow through the narrow veins of country lanes. But the further they pushed, the more fragile the advance became. For every tank that surged ahead, another sputtered and slowed, engines coughing on mismatched American gasoline. Mechanics worked in the snow with frozen fingers, cursing fuel lines that froze, carburetors that clogged, engines that devoured more than they were given. The countryside bore witness to their desperation. German soldiers scoured barns and abandoned houses, searching not for food or ammunition, but for jerry cans. Some begged captured American prisoners to reveal hidden caches. Others siphoned gasoline from disabled vehicles, every drop precious as blood. Officers carried notebooks not with tactical reports, but with tallies of how many gallons remained, how many miles could still be bought before the engines went silent again. And as the column crept deeper, the enemy awoke. American engineers blew bridges before Peiper could reach them, forcing his tanks to detour through muddy fields where fuel was devoured twice as fast. Roadblocks of felled trees, mines and wrecked vehicles slowed the armoured spearhead to a crawl. Every delay was an enemy weapon more effective than bullets or shells. Time itself became a saboteur. Peiper grew restless, his temper sharp as the frozen air. He barked at his officers, demanded speed, demanded ruthlessness. Forward, always forward, he repeated, knowing hesitation meant death. Not only for the offensive, but for his reputation as Hitler's chosen commander. Yet behind the mask of command, he felt the creeping dread. His tigers burned throat, or 60 gallons of fuel every hour. His panthers, though lighter, drained their tanks almost as quickly. The captured reserves that had seemed endless at Honsfeld were vanishing into the snow, leaving only the sound of hollowing fuel tanks and the smell of burning gasoline. To the men in the column, the signs were undeniable. Tanks abandoned by the roadside, their hulking bodies turned into obstacles for those still moving. Soldiers riding on half-tracks, shivering and silent, clutching empty jerry cans like relics. They knew the truth. This was not just a battle against the Americans. It was a battle against the emptiness of the tank, against the ticking clock of consumption. And as the Ardennes stretched out before them, endless and cold, the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper began to realize they were not advancing toward victory. They were advancing toward exhaustion. By December 18th, the snow had thickened, blanketing the Ardennes in silence broken only by the growl of engines and the occasional crack of distant artillery. Peiper's column pressed onward, burning through its dwindling lifeline with every mile. Ahead lay the town of Stavelot, perched along the banks of the Amblève River. To Peiper, it was not just another village. It was a key. Intelligence suggested fuel depots were hidden there, enough to propel his armoured fist further west. If Stavelot fell intact, the Meuse might still be within reach. But the Americans had no intention of surrendering it. As Peiper's lead elements approached, they met a torrent of machine gun fire and anti-tank shells. The narrow stone streets echoed with the roar of combat as Tigers forced their way forward, their 88mm guns smashing houses into rubble. Flames consumed the town, thick smoke curling into the winter sky. Civilians fled in terror, clutching children as artillery shells burst among the rooftops. The Ardennes was no longer a forest of silence. It was a furnace of chaos. Inside the town, American engineers worked frantically, dousing fuel depots in flames before they could be captured. Barrels exploded, sending fireballs into the sky, black smoke marking every gallon denied to the enemy. Peiper's men cursed as they advanced through smoke and debris, finding not salvation but ash. What fuel they did seize was pitiful compared to what they had hoped. Worse still, the river bridge at Stavelot became a killing ground. American Shermans and tank destroyers emerged from the tree line, trading fire with Peiper's Tigers in brutal street combat. Every round fired, every yard gained, cost precious fuel. The irony was bitter. His men were burning gasoline to fight for gasoline. As the battle raged, Peiper's frustration boiled over. He ordered civilians driven from their homes, suspected partis, and executed, and resistance crushed without mercy. For his men, the brutality was an extension of survival. For history, it became part of the shadow that followed Peiper long after the Ardennes campaign ended. By nightfall, the town smouldered, half in German hands, half in ruins. The bridge stood battered but intact, the road to the west open. But the fuel depots that might have sustained the drive were gone in smoke and fire. Peiper had gained ground, but he had not gained time. His tanks rumbled onward, deeper into the frozen Ardennes, their tracks marking a path not of triumph, but of dwindling hope. The morning of December 19th dawned grey and bitterly cold. Snow lay heavy on the branches, muffling the world into a silence that felt almost sacred, until the tanks roared. Peiper's column pushed out of Stavelot, churning toward Stoumont, a village whispered to hide more American fuel. The road wound through steep valleys and dense pine, forcing the massive Tiger tanks into single-file lines. Every kilometre forward devoured fuel, every skirmish bled away both gasoline and time. The men were weary, hollow-eyed from sleepless nights, their uniforms stiff with frost. Mechanics staggered beside the convoy, carrying tools like lifelines, ready to revive any tank that coughed itself into silence. Soldiers scavenged relentlessly, siphoning gasoline from destroyed jeeps, cracking open barrels in abandoned barns, draining even motorcycles left behind by fleeing Americans. A Tiger tank drank 60 gallons an hour, a Panther nearly half as much. Their thirst was insatiable, and every gallon stolen seemed swallowed in an instant. At Stoumont, the nightmare sharpened. The Americans had fortified the village with tanks, artillery, and dug-in infantry. From the windows of stone farmhouses, machine guns raked the advancing Germans. From the fields, Shermans fired shells that burst against Peiper's Tigers in shattering echoes. The Germans answered with their 88s, tearing buildings apart, sending stone and fire into the sky. But the cost was merciless. Each exchange of shells burned the very fuel they fought for. And then came the cruelest blow. When Peiper's men breached Stoumont, the Americans set their depots ablaze. Gallons upon gallons of fuel went up in roaring fireballs, the heat so intense it cracked windows and melted snow into torrents of black water. What Peiper had driven miles to seize was erased in moments. A vision of salvation turned to smoke curling heavenward, his bateau. Men stood in the firelight, faces smeared with ash and fury, watching their last hope burn. The battle dragged into night. Tanks bogged in mud and snow, Trucks broke down, fuel lines froze solid. The column stretched thin, vulnerable, its momentum bleeding away. Peiper ordered his men to press harder, faster, but the truth gnawed at every heart. The Meuse was no longer a destination. It was a dream slipping further away with every empty tank, every abandoned vehicle. In the frozen dark of the Ardennes, Kampfgruppe Peiper was no longer a spearhead. It was a beast starving itself to death, mile by agonizing mile. By December 20th, the illusion of momentum had shattered. Kampfgruppe Peiper, once the armoured spearhead of Hitler's Grand Ardennes gamble, was now a crawling column strangled by fuel starvation. The roads behind were clogged with wrecks, burned-out half-tracks, abandoned tigers, trucks left where their tanks ran dry. Each was a monument to desperation, each one narrowing the lifeline back east. Ahead, the way to the Meuse was blocked not by geography alone, but by the tightening noose of American counterattacks. Reinforcements poured in, armoured divisions racing along intact supply lines, artillery units wheeling into position, fighter bombers overhead once the skies cleared. The fog that had once shielded Peiper's advance now lifted, and with it came Allied dominance. Every road forward was shelled, every bridge contested, every village turned into a fortress. Inside the German tanks, the atmosphere grew desperate. Crews counted gallons like minutes to midnight. Men risked their lives, siphoning fuel from burning wrecks, sometimes crawling through firefights just to drain a few litres from shattered trucks. They fought not only the enemy, but the cruel arithmetic of consumption. 1 tiger, 1 mile, 4 gallons gone forever. The math could not be defied. At Stumont's outskirts, Peiper faced the brutal truth. His tanks could go no further. Mechanics huddled around empty drums, shaking them as if a miracle might slosh inside. Officers argued in hushed tones, some urging retreat, others demanding one last push. Peiper listened, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. He knew the offensive was dying, not in Berlin's maps or speeches, but here, in the snow, where steel giants stood silent with empty bellies. American artillery thundered through the valleys, shells exploding among the immobilized column. The Germans returned fire when they could, but each shot seemed less a strike, and more a gasp. Infantry clung to the frozen ground, hungry, cold, their boots soaked through with icy mud. Morale cracked. Whispers spread through the ranks. "We will not see the Meuse. We will not even see home." For Peiper, the humiliation was unbearable. He had led Hitler's elite, SS soldiers armed with the Reich's last tanks, into the Ardennes with promises of glory. Now he led them into a trap of silence and smoke. The 50,000 gallons seized at Honsfeld had carried them far, but not far enough. The last drops were gone. The column that once roared like a storm now stood still, a monument to ambition strangled by scarcity. December 23rd. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the Ardennes in a silence that mocked the fury of the days before. Kampfgruppe Peiper's tanks sat cold and lifeless, their engines stilled not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The mighty Tiger IIs that once spearheaded his advance now stood like monuments of iron defeat, their barrels jutting uselessly into the winter fog. The dream of reaching the Meuse had frozen to death on these roads. Peiper gathered his officers in the shattered shell of a farmhouse near La Glaise. Around him, maps lay spread across the table, stained with soot and blood, arrows pointing to a destination his men would never reach. The faces staring back at him were gaunt, frostbitten, eyes dulled by exhaustion. They all knew what he was about to say before he opened his mouth. The offensive was over, for them. "We leave the vehicles," Peiper said flatly, his voice cold as the snow outside. The words cut deeper than any bullet. For SS tankers, abandoning their machines was unthinkable, a betrayal of steel and honour. But honour could not feed engines. Honour could not conjure gasoline from frozen earth. The men sat in silence, the truth pressing down on them like the weight of the winter sky. Orders rippled through the column. Crews prepared their tanks for destruction, setting charges to blow the cannons, smashing radios, draining the last dribbles of fuel into fires. Flames licked the night as one by one the giants were silenced forever. The forest echoed with muted explosions, a requiem for machines that had carried them across half of Europe. Soldiers watched with hollow eyes, the glow of burning tigers reflecting in their frozen tears. When the fires died down, the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper became ghosts in the snow. Nearly 800 strong, they stripped down to what they could carry: rifles, a few mortars, meagre rations, scav, angered from villages. No armour, no artillery, no supplies, just men trudging on foot through the Ardennes, hunted by American patrols, their tracks in the snow betraying every step. Peiper marched at the front, his face expressionless, but inside he knew the truth. The Ardennes offensive had not been broken by American steel alone. It had been bled dry by the emptiness of fuel tanks, by the simple arithmetic of logistics. 50,000 gallons had carried them forward like a promise, and then abandoned them in the frozen dark. What had begun as Hitler's final gamble was ending as a retreat of shadows, disappearing into the forest. The retreat began under a moonless sky, the Ardennes swallowed in blackness and snow. Peiper's men trudged single file through the frozen forest, their boots crunching on ice, their breath fogging in the bitter air. The glow of their burning tanks still flickered behind them, a funeral pyre marking where their armoured glory had died. Ahead lay only uncertainty, American patrols, artillery, and starvation. The march was agony. Soldiers stumbled through waist-deep snow, their bodies weak from hunger and exhaustion. Some had not eaten in days, living on scraps of bread, raw potatoes stolen from barns, or even frozen horse meat hacked from carcasses along the road. Frostbite gnawed at their fingers and toes. Men wrapped rags around their feet when boots fell apart, limping on bloody stumps of flesh. The elite of the Waffen-SS had become spectres, hollow-eyed, more dead than alive. American artillery hunted them even in retreat. Flares lit the night sky, revealing columns of men like shadows crossing the snow. Shells whistled down, exploding among the trees, shattering the stillness with fire and screams. The wounded were left behind, their cries fading into the forest. Survival allowed no mercy. To stop was to die, and so the column pressed on, each step driven not by hope but by instinct. Peiper walked at the head, his greatcoat stiff with ice, his eyes burning with a grim resolve. He offered no speeches, no comfort, only the command to keep moving. Behind him, discipline frayed. Men muttered of surrender, of desertion, of slipping away into the woods. Others clung to their commander with blind loyalty, believing that if they followed Peiper, somehow survival was still possible. The Ardennes became their coffin. Snow buried their tracks, muffled their suffering, hid their dead beneath white blankets. By day, they huddled in ruined barns or the frozen hollows of the forest, avoiding American patrols. By night they marched, guided by the pale glimmer of starlight. Hunger hollowed them, frost hardened them, fear drove them. What had begun as an armoured spearhead now resembled a procession of exiles, stripped of everything but the will to keep placing one foot before the other. Each mile carried them further from victory, deeper into despair. And yet Peiper pressed on, his name now tied not to triumph but to a doomed retreat that symbolized the death throes of the Reich itself. By December 24th, the Ardennes forest had devoured what remained of Kampfgruppe Peiper. The column that had entered Belgium as an armoured fist, 80 tanks, hundreds of vehicles, and nearly 5,000 men, was now a threadbare procession of survivors. Their steel beasts lay abandoned in smoking ruins behind them, frozen monuments scattered across the valleys. What staggered onward toward German lines were no longer warriors of an elite division, but frost-bitten shadows. The retreat was marked by silence. The men no longer spoke except in whispers, conserving breath for the endless march. Rifles slung across their backs felt like weights of iron. Helmets were discarded in the snow, boots frozen stiff on swollen feet. Some men collapsed where they stood, unable to rise again, their bodies quickly covered by drifting snow. No one stopped to bury them. There was no time, no strength. Only the living moved forward. American forces tightened the noose. Patrols scoured the woods, artillery pounded crossroads, fighter planes strafed any movement spotted in daylight. Peiper's men survived by cunning and desperation, slipping through ravines, hiding in barns, moving only at night. They were the hunters turned hunted, prey staggering toward a border they could no longer see. Finally, on Christmas Eve, Peiper's ragged band reached German positions near La Glaise. What had once been an armoured juggernaut now numbered barely 800 men, most frostbitten, starving, hollow-eyed. They stumbled into friendly lines with nothing but rifles and the tattered remnants of their uniforms. No tanks, no half-tracks, no supplies. Only the story of a thrust that had burned itself out in less than a week. Peiper himself arrived gaunt, unshaven, his greatcoat stiff with frozen sweat. His face betrayed no emotion, but his silence said everything. He had been tasked with breaking through Teach for the Meuse, with changing the course of the war. Instead, he returned empty-handed, carrying only survivors and the bitter knowledge that logistics, not valour, had undone him. The offensive continued without him, but its spearhead was gone. The 50,000 gallons seized at Honsfeld, the miracle that had once seemed capable of altering history, had been squandered by the relentless truth of arithmetic. Gallons became miles, miles became exhaustion, and exhaustion became defeat. In the end, Kampfgruppe Peiper did not die in a blaze of glory. It starved, froze, and limped back home, a broken fragment of the Reich's last gamble. For the Americans who faced Kampfgruppe Peiper, the Ardennes was both a nightmare and a revelation. In the first days, when reports spread of SS tanks overrunning Honsfeld, Malmedy, and Stoumont, fear gripped the ranks. Soldiers whispered of a German breakthrough, of panzers reaching the Meuse and severing the Allied front. Peiper's name carried with it a sense of dread, whispered like a curse among foxholes. The SS were coming. Yet, as days turned to nights and the thunder of engines behind enemy lines grew quieter, a realization began to dawn. The juggernaut was stalling. American artillery spotters noted German convoys abandoned on roadsides. Pilots reported tanks sitting silent in the snow. Infantry patrols discovered half-tracks left with hatches open, their crews gone. What had been described as an unstoppable armoured wedge was now scattering like a shadow. For the men holding the line, the truth was both shocking and strangely comforting. They had not beaten Peiper's tanks in open battle, at least not entirely. What had truly broken the SS spearhead was fuel. American supply chains stretched like lifelines across Belgium and France, pumping gasoline and ammunition in endless streams to the front. German supply lines, by contrast, were brittle threads already fraying. Peiper's men had stolen 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, but even that miracle could not match the reality of Allied abundance. By Christmas, American soldiers advancing into the villages Peiper had abandoned saw the scale of his failure. Tigers and panthers stood gutted in fields, some burned, some deliberately destroyed, others simply frozen in place. One GI, staring at a king tiger sitting helpless with its turret locked, muttered, "All that steel, and not enough gas to move it a mile." The image spread quickly through the ranks. It was proof. German power was no longer limitless. The Malm Edi massacre cast a darker shadow. News that Peiper's men had executed American prisoners steeled the resolve of Allied troops. Many now saw his retreat not as a tragedy, but as justice. The SS had unleashed terror, and the Ardennes had swallowed them whole. In the end, the Americans learned a lesson as old as war itself, that battles are not won only with bullets and bravery, but with fuel, food, and supply. While Peiper's men froze and starved, the GIs celebrated Christmas with hot coffee, canned turkey, and cigarettes flown in by the ton. One army was living, the other was dying. The Ardennes offensive had been conceived as Hitler's last great stroke of genius, a winter gamble that would split the Allies, seize Antwerp, and perhaps even force a negotiated peace. It was meant to echo the Blitzkrieg of 1940, when German armour had sliced through the same forests and toppled France in weeks. But 1944 was not 1940. The Reich was hollow, bled by years of attrition, and its gamble carried the weight of desperation. Peiper's failure was not an isolated story. It was a microcosm of the entire offensive. Across the Ardennes, German spearheads lunged forward only to sputter out. Some reached within miles of the Meuse, but none could cross it. Bridges were blown, fuel convoys ambushed, American engineers flooded valleys to stall movement. The deeper the panzers pushed, the weaker they became, stretched thin, their flanks exposed, their tanks gasping for fuel that never came. Meanwhile, the Allied response was swift and overwhelming. Eisenhower shifted divisions with ruthless efficiency, rerouting reinforcements from every corner of the front. Patton wheeled his Third Army north in one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the war, smashing into the German southern flank. Air power returned once the skies cleared, hammering convoys, turning icy roads into killing grounds. For every mile the Germans gained, they paid in irreplaceable men, tanks, and fuel. The Ardennes became not the graveyard of Allied resolve, but the graveyard of the Wehrmacht's last strength. What Hitler had envisioned as a reversal of fortune became instead a bloodletting that accelerated Germany's collapse. By January 1945, the offensive was broken, the Bulge pushed back, and the once proud panzer divisions reduced to shadows. Kampfgruppe Peiper stood as the symbol of this failure. His column had embodied the ambition of the offensive, fast, ruthless, spearheaded by Germany's best armour. But it also embodied its doom, starving for fuel, encircled, abandoned in the snow. The image of SS men trudging back on foot through the Ardennes while their tanks lay silent was the perfect mirror of the Reich itself, still dangerous, still feared, but hollow, staggering, destined to fall. What Hitler had gambled on was not strategy, but illusion. Illusion that his armies still had the strength of 1940. Illusion that fuel, steel, and manpower could be conjured out of thin air. Illusion that his enemies would crumble at the sight of panzers in the snow. By the end of December, those illusions lay burning in the Ardennes, alongside the wrecks of Kampfgruppe Peiper. The Ardennes offensive was more than a clash of steel and strategy. It was a slaughterhouse carved into the frozen hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. In just 6 weeks, nearly 20,000 Americans were killed, with another 47,000 wounded and 23,000 captured or missing. For the United States, it was the bloodiest single battle of the war in Europe. Entire companies were wiped out in the snow, young men cut down in forests they had never heard of until they marched into them. For the Germans, the cost was even more ruinous. Estimates vary, but between 80,000 and 100,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. Veteran panzer divisions, the pride of Hitler's armies, were shattered. Tanks lost could never be replaced. Crews were irreplaceable. Even the Waffen-SS, Hitler's favoured elite, returned from the Ardennes as a hollowed remnant, stripped of its aura of invincibility. But beyond numbers, the battle left scars carved deep into memory. Towns like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Malmedy became synonymous with defiance, sacrifice, and atrocity. The massacre at Malmedy, where Peiper's men executed more than 80 American prisoners, seared into Allied minds the ruthless brutality of their enemy. The retaliation, though unspoken, was inevitable. SS troops captured in the Ardennes often faced a fate far harsher than ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. Mercy had frozen to death in the snow. Civilians, too, bore the weight. Belgian villages burned, families fled into the woods, and winter claimed those too weak to move. Survivors told of barns shelled to splinters, of homes looted by retreating soldiers, of bodies buried beneath snowbanks until the spring thaw revealed the truth. For them, the Ardennes was not a battle. It was a season of terror. By January 1945, when the last German troops were driven back, the forests were littered with wreckage, twisted tanks, frozen corpses, shattered trees blacken, ed by shell fire. The Ardennes looked less like a battlefield than a graveyard without end. And yet, out of this carnage, a truth emerged. The offensive had cost the Allies dearly, but it cost Germany everything. The men and machines lost in the Ardennes could never be replaced. Hitler had gambled not just with divisions, but with the Reich's final reserves of fuel, armour and manpower, and he had lost them in the snow. The Battle of the Bulge was not merely the Reich's last offensive, it was its last breath. When the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in doubt. Hitler had thrown his last reserves into the snow, and they had not returned. What remained of the Wehrmacht was broken, incapable of mounting another large-scale offensive. From this moment forward, Germany could only retreat, fighting not for victory, but for survival. The offensive had consumed vast stores of fuel, tanks and men, resources the Reich no longer possessed. Factories bombed to rubble could not replace what was lost. Training camps could not produce new divisions fast enough to fill the gaps. Every Tiger tank left rusting in the Ardennes was not just a battlefield defeat, but a strategic death sentence. By January 1945, the German army was bleeding from wounds that could not be closed. For the Allies, the Ardennes became a crucible of unity. American, British, Canadian, and even Free French forces had held the line together, proving the strength of their coalition. Eisenhower's command, often criticized for its political compromises, had demonstrated its flexibility, shifting armies like chess pieces to blunt the German thrust. The victory gave the Allies momentum, confidence, and the certainty that the end was near. It also accelerated the timetable of the war. Patton's drive north had showcased the ferocity of Allied mobility. Montgomery's counter-offensives from the north closed the Bulge with grinding efficiency, and once the skies cleared, the full weight of Allied air power fell on retreating German forces, turning the Ardennes into a slaughter ground. By February, the Western Front was advancing again, pushing inexorably toward the Rhine. Inside Hitler's bunker in Berlin, the failure of the Ardennes marked a turning point in his own delusions. He had promised his generals that the offensive would change the war, that it would break the Allied coalition. Instead, it revealed the truth even to his most loyal followers. The Reich was finished. Some began to lose faith, others plotted survival, and still others clung to fantasies of miracle weapons and last stands. For the men who had marched with Peiper, the retreat through the Ardennes symbolized not just the end of a battle, but the unraveling of a regime. They had seen firsthand that steel and willpower were no match for hunger, cold, and empty fuel tanks. Their march back through the snow was more than survival, it was prophecy. The Reich itself was staggering the same way, gaunt, starving, trudging toward inevitable collapse. The Ardennes was not Hitler's triumph. It was his epitaph. While the Ardennes burned in the west, the Red Army was preparing its own hammer blow in the east. On January 12, 1945, barely 3 weeks after Peiper's retreat, the Soviets unleashed the Vistula Oder offensive. More than 2 million men, 20,000 artillery pieces and thousands of tanks surged forward, smashing through the remnants of Army Group A. In just 3 weeks, they advanced nearly 300 miles, stopping only at the gates of Berlin itself. The timing was catastrophic for Germany. The Ardennes had consumed the Reich's last mobile reserves, divisions that might have been rushed east to slow the Soviet tide. Instead, they lay frozen in Belgium, their tanks abandoned, their crews limping home on foot. What Hitler had gambled in the west could no longer defend the east. The Reich was collapsing from both directions at once. On the Western Front, the Allies regained momentum with terrifying speed. By late January, the Bulge had been erased and American forces were surging eastward. Patton crossed the Sauer River, Montgomery pressed from the north, and Bradley's armies pushed toward the Siegfried Line. The Rhine, the last great barrier to Germany's heartland, was now in sight. German soldiers who survived the Ardennes found themselves thrown back into the line almost immediately. Exhausted, frostbitten, half-starved, they were told to hold against the Allied tide with little more than rifles and fading morale. Many surrendered at the first chance, convinced the war was lost. Others fought with grim fatalism, knowing they would never see home again. Civilians, too, felt the tightening noose. Refugees clogged roads as the Reich shrank inward, fleeing both the advancing Soviets and the relentless bombing of Allied planes. Villages that had once cheered parades of panzers now braced for artillery barrages. In Berlin, propaganda spoke of miracle weapons and secret armies, but in the countryside, people whispered of defeat, of the day the enemy would arrive at their doors. The Ardennes had been Hitler's last attempt to dictate the tempo of the war. Its failure shifted all initiative to the Allies. From this point onward, Germany no longer attacked, it only endured, bled, and fell back. The Reich had gambled its last ace, and the deck was empty. In the east, the Soviets marched toward Berlin. In the west, the Allies pressed toward the Rhine. And in the middle, Germany staggered, hollow and broken, its fate sealed.